Across survivor testimony, one expectation repeats, quietly, consistently. They anticipated fear. They anticipated pressure. They anticipated thoughts that didn't feel like their own. They did not anticipate physical change. Again and again, people described the same slow realization. Whatever they encountered did not remain confined to the mind, not dramatic at first, not obvious enough to panic over. Sleep disrupted, appetite altered, a persistent sensation of heaviness that didn't behave like anxiety. Several survivors describe an unnerving delay between intention and movement, as if their bodies were responding a fraction of a second late. Medical evaluations rarely find anything unusual. What unsettles them most is not pain. It is the growing sense that the body itself has become occupied terrain. Friends notice first, "You seem different." That word appears across accounts. Different, not possessed, not controlled, shared. When testimonies from different backgrounds are placed side by side, the language converges in an unexpected way. Not voices, not commands, presence. Survivors describe lying awake, fully conscious, feeling something register their breathing, their heartbeat, their physical rhythms. Not forcefully, attentively. Across accounts, the most disturbing detail is not fear, it is adaptation. People describe the sensation changing over time, as if whatever was present adjusted to their bodies. One phrase appears repeatedly in survivor language, often spoken with hesitation. "It felt like I was hosting something." That word stops many of them mid-sentence. Hosting implies accommodation, not agreement, but allowance, duration, consent they never intended to give. That realization marks the moment unease turns into panic, because hosts do not get to pretend nothing is there. If you're watching this because something already feels off, you'll want to stay with this series. When survivors use the word hybrid, they are not describing creatures, mutations, or mythic beings. They are describing something quieter, a blending of influence and embodiment, where the body itself becomes shared ground. That condition produces a specific kind of distress, not terror, but a deep, persistent unsettlement, where nothing feels fully foreign and nothing feels fully one's own. Hybridization is a challenge to one's self-identity. Across multiple survivor accounts, a troubling pattern emerges. The fixation is not primarily psychological, it is physical. Survivors independently describe heightened attention around moments of vulnerability, injury, illness, exhaustion, emotional collapse. Not concern, fascination. Several report the same unsettling shift, a growing detachment from their own bodies. Not self-hatred, disassociation, as if the body were being evaluated rather than inhabited. Common phrases recur across testimonies. "It felt irritated by my limits." "It didn't like weakness." "It seemed impatient with pain, aging, or fatigue." What frightens survivors is not aggression, it is interest. The sense that the body is being treated not as a person, but as a structure. This is where ancient language begins to echo quietly, not about temptation, but about boundaries crossed. Across accounts, there is a moment survivors struggle to describe because it sounds unbelievable even to them. The presence stops pretending to be subtle, not by announcing itself, but by reacting. People describe abrupt shifts when they resisted, prayed, tried grounding, or simply demanded to be left alone. The atmosphere in rooms thickened. Breath felt borrowed, sound dulled then sharpened. Several survivors independently report the same detail, a sensation of being measured. Not threatened, measured, as if resistance triggered assessment rather than retreat. One survivor described it this way: "It didn't get angry, it got focused." Another said, "It felt like it was deciding how much pressure I could handle." Fear escalated because fear was not the response being provoked. Compliance was. What follows is rarely dramatic enough to look supernatural. That's what makes it effective. Survivors describe erosion, not collapse. Work performance declined without explanation. Memory faltered at critical moments. Speech slowed or tangled. Sleep fractured into shallow intervals. Relationships deteriorated. Friends reported emotional flatness. Family noticed personality drift. Spouses described feeling like they were living with someone almost familiar. Several survivors said the most frightening part was how normal everything still looked. Bills got paid, schedules held, conversations continued. But inside, something felt off balance, like living in a house where the foundation had shifted by inches, not enough to see, enough to feel. Survivors almost never speak at this stage, not because nothing is happening, but because something actively discourages speech. Across accounts, people describe a sudden corrosive shame that does not match their actions, not guilt, exposure. They feel seen in a way that strips dignity rather than invites confession. Several survivors describe trying to write down what was happening, only to stop mid-sentence, overwhelmed by the certainty that naming it would make things worse. One said, "It felt like being told, 'You're already marked, talking won't help.'" That word, marked, appears often, usually whispered, as if saying it aloud might finalize something. Isolation follows naturally. Phone calls go unanswered. Appointments are cancelled. Trusted voices feel distant, almost hostile. One survivor said the presence reacted strongly whenever she tried to pray, not violently but dismissively, as if mocking the attempt. Another described the sudden sensation of being cut off, like a branch removed quietly, not snapped. That quiet separation does more damage than fear ever could, because fear drives people toward help. Shame drives them away from it. Nearly every survivor can identify a single moment that changed everything, a moment when the encounter crossed from terrifying into profoundly wrong. It isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it happens in silence. A sudden bodily reaction that feels observed, a thought that arrives fully formed, intrusive, obscene, alien. A wave of contempt toward innocence, not anger but disdain. Several survivors described the same horrifying realization. Whatever was present did not fear boundaries. It behaved as if it already knew the rules had shifted. One survivor described feeling like a house whose doors had been unlocked from the inside. Another said, "It felt like something was testing where I ended." That word, ended, matters, because the moment survivors remember most clearly is when they realized this was not about temptation, it was about erasure. The goal was not obedience, it was occupation. Not possession in the old sense, something colder, something that wanted to remain. Most survivors don't start with scripture. They arrive there accidentally, months later, sometimes years. A phrase overheard, a story remembered from childhood, a passage stumbled into while searching for anything that explains what happened. And when it clicks, it hits like grief. Words like vessel, image, seed, mixture, corruption stop sounding symbolic. They sound descriptive. One survivor said, "I didn't feel like I learned something new. I felt like I remembered something I was never supposed to forget." Another described reading an old warning about boundaries and suddenly understanding why the experience felt illegal, not just frightening, as if a line had been crossed that was never meant to be negotiable. This is when survivors stop asking, "Why me?" and start asking something much more unsettling. How long has this been happening? Because the pattern feels ancient, rehearsed, as if the outrage wasn't random, but repeated. Here is what survivors agree on, even when everything else differs. Whatever they encountered did not behave like a predator in a hurry. It behaved like something patient, something familiar with the terrain. Influence was the opening move. Shame was the containment. The body was the objective. And once survivors recognize that pattern, a final realization settles in, heavy, unavoidable. This was never about haunting a house. It was about inhabiting what was meant to carry something else. In the next episode, we step out of analysis and into response. Not theories, not rituals, but what people did, practically, imperfectly, when influence stopped being subtle and resistance became necessary. Because some didn't just endure this. They fought back.
Cheers!